I hired him in early summer, the kind of summer that makes the air shimmer above the grass, where everything feels too alive. The roses had overgrown their borders, and the vines on the terrace had turned wild. I told myself I needed a gardener. What I didn't admit, not even to myself, was that I needed a distraction. He arrived with the morning sun, a pair of worn gloves in his back pocket, and a half smile that seemed to know too much. His name was Daniel, 22, maybe 23. His age showed not in immaturity, but in how completely unguarded he seemed, as if the world hadn't yet taught him restraint. He was 38, divorced, comfortable, and very, very composed. When he asked where to begin, I pointed to the garden beds beneath the windows of my study, the ones I could see every time I looked up from my desk. He nodded, not questioning my choice. But when he turned to start, I caught the briefest glance over his shoulder, curious, assessing. The kind of glance a man gives when he notices something he shouldn't. And for a moment, I felt seen. Too seen, it started small. It always does. The sound of his boots on the gravel when I was working, the low hum of him whistling beneath the window, the scent of soil and green things that drifted in when he was near. I told myself I was imagining the shift, the pulse that started every time he walked past. I've always liked control, always worn it like armor. It's what saved me when my marriage cracked apart, when people whispered about how I was too proud, too cold, too sure of myself. But Daniel didn't seem intimidated by that. He smiled when I gave orders. He met my eyes when I expected him not to. He moved with a quiet confidence that unsettled me. Not arrogance, but presence. One afternoon, I brought him a glass of water. It was hot enough to make the air tremble, and sweat glistened along his neck as he wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked up, eyes catching mine. "You didn't have to," he said, his voice low and warm. "I know," I replied, and set the glass on the stone wall between us. Our fingers brushed, barely, but it was enough to make something inside me flicker, like the moment before lightning strikes. He didn't move away. Neither did I. When I finally did, I told myself it was nothing. A momentary awareness, a passing thought. But that night I couldn't sleep. He came every other day after that. The garden began to change. Wilder in some ways, softer in others. He didn't just prune or cut. He coaxed things into bloom. Watching him work became an unspoken ritual. I'd find reasons to walk through the garden when he was there, pretending to inspect his progress, pretending not to look too long. Once, he caught me watching. "You like it?" he asked, gesturing to the roses, their petals deep red against the light. "They look alive again," I said. "So do you," he answered before he could stop himself. Silence. A moment that stretched and pulsed between us. He looked down quickly, muttering something about trimming the hedges. I turned away, pretending not to hear, but my pulse betrayed me. It had been years since a man's words made me feel anything I couldn't name. Later that week, it rained. A heavy, unrelenting storm that soaked the earth and turned the garden into a dark mirror. He arrived anyway, his shirt clinging to his skin, his hair damp and curling. "You didn't have to come in this weather," I said from the doorway. "You said the roses needed tending," he replied with a grin. "Besides, I don't mind the rain." I should have told him to go home. Instead, I stood there watching him work, sleeves rolled up, water dripping from his jaw, the rhythm of his movements slow and deliberate. When thunder cracked, he finally stepped under the terrace roof, shaking his head like a dog, droplets scattering in the air. He looked up and smiled, boyish, unguarded. I felt something in my chest loosen. I offered him a towel, and as he took it, our hands touched again, just for an instant, but this time neither of us moved. His fingers were warm despite the rain, rough with work, grounding. I looked up, too long, too close, and saw the question in his eyes mirrored in my own. We stood there, both silent, both pretending the air between us wasn't charged. Finally, I said, "You should go before it gets worse." He nodded. but his gaze lingered on me, steady, searching, before he stepped back into the storm. That night, I walked through the house barefoot, lights dim, the windows still streaked with rain. The garden was a shadowed blur beyond the glass, but I could see where he'd been, the freshly turned soil, the order within the wildness. I pressed my palm against the cool pane and realized how quiet the house had become. I'd built my life on solitude, on structure and control, and for the first time in years, I wasn't sure I wanted it anymore. When I finally went to bed, I could still feel the warmth of his hand, the echo of his voice. It wasn't just attraction, it was something more dangerous. Recognition. Because in his presence, I wasn't just the composed, distant woman everyone thought I was. I was alive, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I found a single rose lying on the terrace wall. One of the deep red ones, the same he'd revived from neglect. Its petals were still wet from the rain, and beneath it, a small note written in careful handwriting. You said they were alive again. No name. No explanation, just that. I held it for a long time, the morning light spilling over my hands, and for the first time, I didn't try to talk myself out of what I felt, because whatever this was, this slow, silent pull between us, it wasn't harmless anymore. It was the beginning of something neither of us could unfeel. It's strange how easily routines become rituals. How something as simple as his footsteps on the gravel could begin to feel like part of my heartbeat. Daniel came every morning now. He didn't wait to be told. I'd find him in the garden just after dawn, sleeves rolled up, working in quiet rhythm with the world waking around him. There was peace in the way he moved, unhurried, grounded, as if the earth itself answered to his touch. And yet, every time he straightened and met my eyes, that peace broke into something else. Something electric. I tried to convince myself it was still harmless. That the warmth in my chest when I saw him was just admiration. That the way my voice softened when I said his name was just habit. But it wasn't. We both knew it wasn't. One morning, I brought him coffee. The air was cool, soft with mist. He was kneeling near the fountain, trimming lavender, the scent thick in the air. I handed him the cup, and our fingers brushed again. By now, that simple touch felt like a language of its own. He looked up at me. You shouldn't do that, he said quietly. What? Bring me things. It makes it harder to forget your... He stopped. My employer? I finished for him, forcing a small, dry smile. He nodded, then glanced away, jaw tight. Something like that. I should have laughed. Should have told him he was being dramatic, but I didn't, because I could feel the truth trembling under his words, matching the tremor in my chest. So instead, I said softly, maybe I don't want you to forget. The silence after that was unbearable, heavy with everything neither of us dared to name. He didn't answer, just looked at me with eyes that seemed to see past all my walls. That look stayed with me for days. After that, something changed between us. The air itself seemed to pulse when we were near each other. I became aware of everything. The sound of his voice, the heat of the afternoon sun on his skin, the scent of crushed herbs when he passed by. We talked more, though it never felt casual. He told me about his studies, landscape architecture, how this was just temporary until he could afford to move to the city. He spoke with quiet conviction, his dreams steady and unembarrassed. I listened more than I spoke. But when I did, it was as if the words came from a place I'd buried for years. Honest, unguarded. I told him things I hadn't told anyone since my divorce. How silence can become a kind of armor. How loneliness can feel safer than love. He didn't flinch from my honesty. He met it with his own. Simple, real, unfiltered. You don't scare me, he said once. When I warned him I could be difficult. You should, I replied, half teasing, half pleading. He smiled. I won't. And somehow, that smile undid me. One evening, I found him still in the garden long after the sun had set. A small lantern glowed beside him as he watered the hydrangeas. "You're working late," I said, stepping out onto the terrace. He looked up, surprised. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Thought maybe I'd finish this row." "Couldn't sleep," I echoed quietly. "That makes two of us." For a while we just stood there, me on the terrace, him a few steps below, the air between us heavy and still. The night hummed softly with crickets, and the light from the lantern cast golden shadows across his face. "Do you ever feel like—" he started, then stopped. "Like what? Like you're trying not to want something you already do?" My breath caught. He wasn't looking at me when he said it, but I knew he wasn't talking about the garden. I could have lied. Could have laughed it off. Instead, I said the truth. Every day. He looked up then, and that was the moment everything shifted. The space between us felt alive, magnetic. The night air thickened, trembling. I took a step forward, and so did he, until the difference in height, age, circumstance, all of it, seemed to dissolve. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. He reached up as if to brush a leaf from my sleeve, but his hand lingered. My pulse was a drumbeat in my throat. His touch was careful, reverent, as though he was afraid I'd vanish if he moved too fast. I didn't pull away. It wasn't surrender in the way people imagine it. It was quieter, deeper. Like exhaling after years of holding your breath. I realized in that stillness that I wasn't losing control. I was simply letting myself feel. After that night, we moved through our days as if nothing had happened. But everything had. I'd catch him looking at me from across the yard, a glance that burned and soothed at once. Our conversations became softer, slower. Words turned into small pauses, small breaths. The world around us, the gossiping neighbors, the rules, the years between us, all seemed to blur at the edges. One afternoon, I came home early and found him trimming the wisteria near the veranda. He didn't see me at first. I stood watching, the late sun washing everything gold. He looked so certain, so unself-conscious that it made me ache. I realized how long it had been since I'd simply wanted someone's presence, not their perfection, not their approval, just them. When he finally noticed me, he smiled, a slow, knowing thing that reached his eyes. "Are you ever going to tell me what you're thinking when you look at me like that?" he asked. "No," I said, smiling back. "Some things are better left unsaid." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And some things are better admitted." It was disarming. His honesty, his ease. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I looked at him, really looked, and said quietly, "Maybe someday." He nodded, accepting the answer as if it was enough. And somehow, it was. Because in that moment, words weren't needed. Everything between us was already spoken, in glances, silences, the quiet gravity that pulled us toward each other despite everything. That night, I stood by my window, the scent of wisteria drifting in. The moonlight touched the garden he'd brought back to life, every petal and leaf shimmering in silver. And I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. I didn't just want him near. I needed him, his steadiness, his warmth, the way he looked at me like I wasn't a chapter that had ended, but one that was still being written. It terrified me, but it also made me feel alive. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what people might say, or what lines I shouldn't cross. I was thinking about the way the world felt when he was in it, and maybe that was the real surrender, not in giving up control, but in allowing myself to want again. There's a moment when silence becomes unbearable, not because it's empty, but because it's too full. That's what the weeks after our surrender felt like. Daniel and I had crossed some invisible threshold, and though nothing had been said aloud, the world around us seemed to hum with what we'd left unsaid. He still came every morning, still tended the roses and the ivy and the lavender, but something in the way he moved had changed, slower, watchful, almost careful, and I, for all my practiced composure, couldn't meet his eyes without feeling my pulse trip. The garden that once calmed me had become a mirror. Every bloom, every scent, every breeze seemed to echo what I tried to hide. Desire, fear, hope. They tangled together like the vines he used to untangle with his bare hands. One afternoon, I overheard a neighbor talking through the fence, casual, careless words that sliced sharper than they meant to. "Isn't it strange?" she said to another voice. "A man that young spending so much time at her house? People are starting to wonder." I didn't move. I just stood there, hidden by the hydrangeas, the sound of their laughter curling around me like smoke. When Daniel appeared a few minutes later, wiping dirt from his hands, I felt the weight of their judgment pressing down, the reminder of the world beyond this quiet space we'd created. He saw my face and frowned. "What happened?" "Nothing," I lied. Then softer. "Everything." He set his tools down. "Tell me." I hesitated, then shook my head. "They're talking. About us." He didn't look surprised. "Let them," I almost laughed. "You don't understand, Daniel. They'll make it ugly. They always do." He stepped closer, eyes steady. "Then let them talk. I'm not ashamed of what I feel." His certainty undid me. I wanted to be that brave, that simple. But I'd lived long enough to know that the world doesn't forgive women like me. Women who want without apology, who take without permission. I turned away, voice trembling. "You should go." "No," he said quietly. "Daniel, no." He took another step forward. "I'm not walking away because someone else is uncomfortable. Are you?" The question cut deep, not as accusation, but truth. I met his eyes, and for the first time, I didn't have an answer. For days, I avoided him. Told him to take time off. Pretended to be busy. The house felt too quiet without him. The garden began to wilt, not from neglect, but from absence. At night, I'd sit by the window, looking at the faint outline of the terrace in moonlight, wondering if he thought of me too. Every rational thought said it was better this way, that I had too much to lose. But the ache in my chest argued otherwise, and then one morning I found the gate open. He was there, standing by the fountain, sunlight catching in his hair, as if he'd never left. "I told you to take a break," I said, but my voice was softer than I meant it to be. He smiled, not the confident one, but the quiet, patient one. "I did, but you didn't say how long." I almost smiled back. Almost. He studied me for a moment, then asked, "Do you really want me to go?" I should have said yes. Should have told him this was impossible. Instead, I said nothing. He walked closer, the gravel crunching softly under his boots. When he stopped in front of me, the air seemed to still. "Tell me to leave," he said, voice low, "and I will." I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the boy people might think he was, but the man he'd quietly become in the spaces between our silences. And I realized I didn't want him to go. "Not anymore. I can't," I whispered. The relief in his face was almost painful to see, and before I could think, before I could protect myself with logic or fear, I stepped forward and rested my forehead against his chest. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was quiet, trembling, human. His hands came up, slow, unsure, and rested against my back. We stood there, surrounded by the scent of earth and rain and everything we hadn't said. After that, something shifted. We didn't hide, but we didn't announce ourselves either. The world, I learned, grows bored quickly with what it can't define. He kept working, though his hours stretched longer, sometimes until the sun dipped below the trees. Sometimes we'd talk. Sometimes we wouldn't. Sometimes we'd simply exist side by side, the silence between us soft, not heavy. The garden flourished again, wilder, fuller, a little untamed, just like us. One evening, he found me sitting by the pond, watching the reflection of the sky turning gold. He sat beside me without a word. For a long time, we just watched the water. Then he said quietly, "You know, when I first came here, I thought you were unreachable." I smiled faintly. And now? Now I think you just needed someone to see you. That simple truth undid me more than any confession could. I turned to him, heart full and unsteady. You did, he smiled, slow, certain. Good. Weeks later, the first autumn leaves began to fall. The garden turned amber, softer. The air smelled like endings, but it didn't feel like one. He told me he'd been accepted into a landscape program in the city, a scholarship, something he'd worked for quietly, persistently. I was proud of him. And terrified. When do you leave? I asked. 2 weeks. I nodded, swallowing the ache in my throat. You should go. He reached for my hand. I will, but not without saying goodbye. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about losing him. It was about letting him become who he was meant to be. Love, I realized, isn't always about possession. Sometimes it's about peace, about seeing someone walk toward their future knowing you helped them bloom. The day he left, the sky was bright and clear. The garden glowed with late summer color. He hugged me once, firm, steady. And when he pulled back, there was a light in his eyes that wasn't sadness but something gentler. I'll come back, he said. I smiled. You don't have to promise that. I want to. And then he was gone. Down the path, through the gate, sunlight catching his shoulders until he disappeared from view. I thought that would be the end. But months later, when winter was just beginning to fade, I found a letter in the mailbox, no name on the envelope, just the faint scent of lavender and soil. Inside, a single line written in that same careful handwriting. The garden looks alive again. I stood there in the pale morning light, the paper trembling in my hands. And for the first time in years I laughed, soft, free, unguarded. Because he was right. It was alive. I was alive, and that, I realized, was the truest kind of love, not the one that burns everything down, but the one that teaches you to bloom again. If this story made your heart ache just a little, hit like, drop a comment and tell me your favorite moment. A follow for more slow burn, age gap love stories that linger long after the end. Your support keeps the stories blooming. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.